It was a peaceful Sunday afternoon when the Thompson family first arrived at their new home. Nestled at the edge of the small town of Raven Hollow, the old Victorian house was exactly what they'd been looking for. A place with character, charm, and just the right amount of space for their growing family. Daniel Thompson, a young lawyer, had always dreamed of living in a house like this. His wife, Emma, shared his enthusiasm, while their two children, Sophie and Noah, were simply excited to move away from the hustle and bustle of city life. The house, though old, was beautiful. Its tall, imposing presence loomed at the end of a long, winding driveway, surrounded by overgrown trees that seemed to stretch toward the sky like gnarled fingers. The front yard was quiet, eerily still, and the creaking of the wooden gate as they entered gave the impression that the house had been waiting for them. They hadn't expected much from the small town, but the peace and seclusion it promised was something they had longed for. First, everything seemed perfect. The house, though aging, had been well maintained, and the air smelled faintly of lavender and wood polish. The wood floors were warm beneath their feet, and sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, bathing the interior in a golden glow. As they unpacked and settled into their new life, Daniel couldn't help but feel that they had found a sanctuary, a place to escape the noise of the world. But it wasn't long before strange things began to happen. It started small, just little things that could easily be explained away. A door that seemed to creak shut on its own. The faint sound of footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. The cold drafts that would suddenly sweep through the rooms, leaving a chill on the skin. At first, Emma chalked it up to the house settling, but even she couldn't ignore the sense of unease that had slowly begun to seep into their once peaceful home. One night, after the children had gone to bed, Daniel was alone in the living room, reading through some work documents. He had just turned the page when he heard it, the soft, almost imperceptible sound of whispers. At first, he thought it was the wind, or perhaps the house itself groaning under its own weight. But as the whispers grew louder, he realized they were words, though they were too faint to make out. He stood up, his heart pounding in his chest, and crept toward the source of the noise, the old family portrait hanging on the wall above the fireplace. He stared at the faces of the people in the painting, their eyes dark and hollow, as if they were watching him. The whispers seemed to come from behind the frame, low and muffled, like they were calling his name. Daniel, Daniel. His blood ran cold. He turned away quickly, trying to shake the feeling, but the whispering continued, echoing in his mind. Emma heard it too. That night, as they lay in bed, she turned to Daniel, her face pale. "Did you hear it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "The voices," she added, barely above a breath. "In the walls. In the house." Daniel didn't know how to respond. He tried to reassure her, telling her it was just the house settling. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. The air felt heavier now, thicker with an energy that seemed to press against his chest. Days passed, and the whispers grew louder. The children, too, began to sense that something was wrong. Sophie, who had always been a brave child, became withdrawn. She stopped playing outside, avoiding the dark corners of the house. Noah, just 7 years old, started talking about the shadows that followed him around the house. He'd sit in the corner of the living room, staring at the wall, speaking to no one in particular. One evening, after dinner, the family sat around the table, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Emma was talking about a local charity event she had heard about, and Daniel was scanning through some papers when Sophie suddenly looked up from her plate, her eyes wide with fear. "Mama," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The man. He's here again." Emma turned toward her daughter, confusion written on her face. "What man, darling?" "The man in the shadows," Sophie replied, her voice trembling. He watches us from the hallway. He always watches. Emma's stomach twisted in knots. She looked toward Daniel, who was now staring intently at Sophie, his face pale. It was the first time Sophie had spoken of this man, and the terror in her eyes was unmistakable. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Daniel and Emma stayed up late, talking about their growing fears. They had no answers, only the nagging feeling that the house, with its creaky floors and whispering walls, was hiding something from them. As they spoke, they began to hear it again, the faint murmur of voices. But this time, the whispers were clearer. They could hear their names. Daniel, Emma, Sophie, Noah. The voices grew louder, coming from all directions. Emma stood up, her heart racing. "Where is it coming from?" she demanded, her eyes wild with fear. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house, as if something heavy had been dropped in the hallway. The room went cold, and Daniel's breath caught in his throat. "Did you hear that?" Emma gasped. Before Daniel could respond, they heard it, a low, guttural growl. The sound seemed to come from the walls, vibrating the floor beneath them. They froze, paralyzed with fear, as the growl grew louder, more menacing. "Get the kids," Daniel whispered, his voice shaking. "Now." As Emma rushed to the children's room, Daniel moved cautiously toward the hallway. The growl was louder now, a deep, throaty sound that reverberated through the house. It was almost as if the house itself was alive, its walls pulsing with an energy that was anything but natural. When Emma returned with the children, Daniel was standing at the foot of the stairs, staring up into the darkness. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. "Daniel," Emma said softly, but he didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on something beyond the top of the stairs, something that wasn't there before. Suddenly, a shadow moved across the wall at the top of the staircase. Emma gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadow moved again, and this time it was unmistakable. It was the figure of a man, tall and gaunt, with eyes that gleamed like coals in the darkness. But there was something wrong about it. The figure was transparent, shifting in and out of view, as if it didn't quite belong to the world of the living. "Who are you?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it began to move down the stairs, slowly and deliberately. "Daniel, we have to leave," Emma cried out, but it was too late. The figure had reached the bottom of the stairs. It stopped and looked directly at them, its hollow eyes staring into their souls. And then, with a voice that was cold and ancient, it whispered one final sentence. "Your past has come to claim you." The darkness in the house seemed to close in around them. The words hung in the air, cold and haunting. "Your past has come to claim you." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as the figure at the bottom of the stairs slowly stepped forward. He instinctively moved closer to Emma, pulling her and the children into his protective embrace. For a moment, the shadow just stood there, silent and still, its hollow eyes burning into them as if it could see every fear, every hidden guilt they carried. Emma's breath was shallow, her face pale as she gripped Daniel's arm, trying to steady herself. But Daniel couldn't move. His legs felt like they were made of stone, his body frozen in place, unable to tear his gaze away from the figure. Suddenly, the figure began to move. It wasn't a fluid motion, but more like a jarring, unnatural glide, its transparent form flickering in and out of existence, like it was struggling to stay in this world. The figure's feet barely seemed to touch the ground as it inched closer to them. "Who are you?" Daniel managed to choke out, his voice hoarse with fear. The figure didn't answer immediately. It tilted its head, studying them as though it had all the time in the world. Then, In a voice that seemed to come from both far away and right next to their ears, it whispered again, "You cannot escape what you have done." Emma squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the sound. Daniel could feel her trembling against him. He didn't know what to do, how to protect them. There was no weapon in the house that could stop something like this. This wasn't just a man or an intruder. This was something far worse. The figure continued to drift closer, its presence chilling the air, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. Daniel's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. What did the figure mean by the past coming to claim them? What had they done? The house suddenly seemed too small. The walls felt as though they were closing in. Daniel's thoughts were racing, but there was one thing he knew for sure. They couldn't stay here. They needed to leave, to escape the house that was beginning to feel like a prison. "Get the children," he whispered urgently to Emma, his voice barely audible. But just as Emma turned to move, the figure spoke again, louder this time, almost as if it were shouting into their minds. "Leave if you wish, but you cannot run from your sins." Daniel felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The air was thick, like it was pressing in on him from all sides. His hands clenched into fists as the words echoed in his ears, mingling with the sound of the figure's steady, unearthly presence. Sophie and Noah clung to Emma, their eyes wide with terror. The fear in their innocent faces only made the situation worse. Daniel couldn't let them stay here, but where could they go? The town was miles away, and they were far from any help. Then, as if sensing his thoughts, the figure pointed toward the door, its long, bony finger directing their gaze to the front of the house. "You will find no peace outside," it said coldly. "This is where your reckoning begins." The words cut through Daniel like a knife, sending a wave of cold dread flooding over him. He didn't know what the figure meant, but he knew one thing for sure. It wasn't just a ghost. This was something far more sinister. The figure began to step backward, retreating into the shadows, but not without one final word. "You are not alone," it whispered. "There are many more who have come, and they will never rest." And then, with a shudder, the figure disappeared into the darkness, vanishing as if it had never been there at all. The house, which had felt suffocating moments before, suddenly felt eerily quiet. The air returned to normal, but the weight of what had just happened lingered like a shadow over them all. For a long moment, none of them moved. Daniel stood frozen in place, his heart hammering in his chest. Emma was still holding Sophie and Noah, her face pale and ashen, her eyes wide with fear. The children were clinging to her, looking around the room, their little faces filled with confusion and terror. "We need to leave," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes still darting nervously toward the stairs. "Now?" Daniel nodded, his mind racing. But where could they go? The house was the only place they had. It had been their dream home, the sanctuary they'd been searching for, but now it felt like a trap, one they couldn't escape from. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind blew through the room, causing the curtains to flutter wildly. Daniel turned toward the window, but there was nothing outside. The night was still, unnaturally so, and the only sound was the soft rustle of the leaves in the trees outside. "We can't stay here," Daniel said firmly, his voice more resolute than he felt. "I'm taking you all to a hotel. We'll figure out what to do tomorrow." But even as the words left his mouth, he felt the weight of the situation pressing on him. This wasn't a simple haunting. Whatever was happening in this house was far more dangerous. He could feel it deep in his bones. As they gathered their things, Daniel's mind kept returning to the figure and its cryptic words. "You cannot escape what you have done." What did it mean? What did they do that had caused the spirits of the past to come for them? The more Daniel thought about it, the more certain he became that the house was hiding something. something that had been buried for years, perhaps decades. A history of wrongs that could never be undone. And then, as if to confirm his thoughts, they heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible scratching noise came from the walls. It started as a quiet sound, barely noticeable, but soon it grew louder, more frantic, like nails scraping against the wood. Daniel's blood ran cold as he looked around, but no one else seemed to hear it at first. The children were still holding on to Emma, eyes wide, but they seemed oblivious to the sound. But Daniel knew it was real. The scraping noise was getting louder, more intense, as if something or someone was trying to get inside. "Get the kids," he said sharply, pulling Emma toward the door. "Now!" As they rushed out of the room, the scratching grew into a deafening cacophony. It was coming from every direction. The walls seemed to be vibrating as if something was trying to claw its way through. Then, with a deafening crash, a door down the hallway slammed open. Daniel turned in horror, his heart racing. The house was no longer just haunted, it was alive, and it was angry. The night was oppressive, suffocating. The house creaked under the weight of its own history, every groan of the walls echoing like a distant warning. Daniel moved quickly, pulling Emma and the kids away from the door, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. The house was alive with menace. The scratching had ceased for now, but the feeling of being watched lingered like a shadow they couldn't escape. "We have to go," Daniel urged, his voice low but firm. Emma's eyes were wide with fear, her face pale. She was gripping Sophie and Noah tightly, trying to shield them from the terrifying unknown. But her trembling hands betrayed her fear. "Where do we go, Daniel?" she asked, her voice cracking. "There's nowhere safe. What's happening to us?" Daniel had no answer. He didn't know. All he knew was that they couldn't stay in this house any longer. It was as if it had come alive, and the spirits of the past were closing in, their vengeance growing stronger with every passing moment. The house had once been their dream home. They'd searched for months before finally settling on it, drawn in by its charm and history. But now, every corner felt like it was hiding something. Every room seemed to hold secrets just out of reach, waiting to be uncovered. And the figure they had seen, the one that had warned them about their past, had made it clear. The house was no longer theirs. It had claimed them, and they would never be free. "We need to get to the car," Daniel said, his voice tight with urgency. He grabbed the keys from the counter, his hand shaking as he stuffed them into his pocket. "Come on, we're leaving now." But as he turned toward the door, a sound stopped him cold. A soft, scraping noise, like fingernails against glass, came from somewhere behind him. He spun around, but the hallway was empty. The house seemed still, as though nothing had moved, nothing had changed. But Daniel knew better. The walls were closing in on them, and the spirits were coming. "We need to hurry," Daniel muttered, his voice rising in panic. He didn't know what else to do, where else to go. The town was too far, and the car wasn't going to protect them. It wasn't the house they needed to escape. It was the darkness within it. Emma hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously toward the door. "Daniel, I can't leave. I feel like if we step outside, it'll follow us." Daniel's heart pounded as he glanced at her. He could see the terror in her eyes, the fear that had taken hold of her, but he couldn't let it control them. He had to keep his family safe no matter what. "Emma, we have to go," he said, his voice steady, but his insides were churning with dread. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond their reach, something they couldn't see but could feel. Suddenly, the house shook. It was a violent tremor, so strong that the furniture rattled and the glass in the windows vibrated. Sophie and Noah screamed, clinging to Emma in terror. The walls groaned under the pressure, as if the house itself was alive, shaking with rage. Daniel staggered backward, his mind racing. This wasn't just a haunting. This was something else, something far darker, far more dangerous. "Please, Daniel," Emma begged, her voice breaking. "We can't stay here. I feel like it's watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. It's like it wants us to leave, but at the same time, it doesn't want to let us go." Daniel looked around, his thoughts spinning. He couldn't deny what Emma was saying. The house felt like a prison, a trap, and with every passing moment, the presence within it seemed to grow stronger, more tangible. But they couldn't stay here. Not anymore. Whatever was happening, whatever had taken hold of this house, it was growing more powerful. And if they didn't leave now, they might never get the chance. With a sense of finality, Daniel grabbed Emma's hand and tugged her toward the front door. But just as they reached the threshold, a loud bang echoed through the house, and the door slammed shut with a force that nearly knocked them off their feet. Daniel's heart leaped in his chest as he tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the outside, as if someone or something was keeping them trapped inside. "Daniel, what's happening?" Emma gasped, her voice rising in panic. The children were sobbing now, their little bodies trembling as they huddled together. Daniel could hear their cries, but the noise felt distant, muffled, as if it was coming from another world. "We're trapped," Daniel muttered under his breath. His pulse raced, and his hands trembled as he tried to force the door open. But it was no use. The door wouldn't move. Suddenly, a sound broke through the silence. It was faint at first, but as it grew louder, Daniel's blood ran cold. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking just behind them. But when Daniel turned around, no one was there. The footsteps continued, getting louder, closer. They were coming from inside the house, and they were moving toward them. "Emma, we need to hide," Daniel whispered, his voice low and urgent. "There's no way out. We need to find somewhere safe." But as he turned to look for a hiding place, something caught his eye. In the distance, down the hallway, he saw a shadow move. It was a fleeting glimpse, too quick for him to make out any details, but it was enough to send a cold shiver down his spine. Without thinking, Daniel grabbed Emma and the children and dragged them toward the staircase. They couldn't stay on the ground floor. The shadows were everywhere. The only chance they had was to get higher, get away from whatever was hunting them. But as they ascended the stairs, Daniel could hear the footsteps behind them, getting closer. He turned to look, but all he could see were the flickering lights, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. "Daniel, please," Emma whimpered. She was already terrified, and the weight of what was happening was starting to break her down. "We have to keep going," Daniel said, his voice firm despite the fear building inside him. He didn't know what was chasing them, but he knew they couldn't stop now. They reached the second floor, but the house seemed even darker here. The air was thick with the scent of something foul, something decaying. Daniel's heart was pounding, and every nerve in his body screamed at him to turn back, to escape before it was too late. But it was too late. The door at the end of the hallway slammed shut with a deafening crash. And in that moment, Daniel realized the truth. They were not alone. The footsteps were right behind them. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, Daniel couldn't move. He stood frozen on the second floor landing, his hand gripping the railing so tightly that his knuckles ached. His heart was pounding in his chest, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up as a chilling silence filled the house. The air seemed to thicken around them, pressing in from all sides, suffocating them with an unseen weight. The house felt alive, its very walls pulsating with something dark and ancient, something that had been waiting for them. "Daniel." Emma's voice trembled in the dim light, barely a whisper. What's happening?" Daniel turned slowly, his eyes scanning the hallway. The children were clinging to Emma, their faces pale with fear. Sophie was crying softly, her small hands clutching her mother's shirt as if it were a lifeline. Noah, on the other hand, stood still, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring at something in the distance. "Daddy, what's that?" Noah whispered, pointing toward the end of the hallway. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. At the far end of the corridor, barely visible in the dim light, there was a door. But it wasn't like the other doors in the house. This one was different, older, darker, almost as if it had been there long before the rest of the house had been built. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light seeped from the crack, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Daniel swallowed hard. He didn't want to look, but something inside him, a pull, a sense of inevitability, compelled him to move toward it. "Stay here," he said, his voice hoarse, as he took a cautious step forward. But Emma grabbed his arm, her grip tight. "Daniel, no, don't go near it. Something's wrong." He could feel her fear, but it wasn't just fear for their safety. It was something deeper, something primal. Emma had sensed it too. The house, whatever it was drawing them in, and that room seemed to be the focal point. "I have to see," Daniel muttered, his voice barely a whisper. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Answers, maybe, or just the need to understand what was happening. But the door was calling to him, just like the footsteps had. With a deep breath, he gently pulled Emma's hand away from his arm. "Stay with the kids. I won't be long." Emma hesitated, then nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "Hurry, Daniel. Please. I don't like this." Daniel didn't say anything. He couldn't. He turned away from his family and slowly made his way down the hallway toward the door. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last, a reminder that he was walking into the unknown. The closer he got, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the air itself had thickened, making it harder to breathe. His chest felt tight, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn back. But he couldn't. He had to know. He had to understand why they were being drawn into this nightmare. When he reached the door, he paused, his hand hovering over the handle. The light from the crack was almost blinding now, and the shadows on the walls seemed to shift, moving in unnatural ways, stretching and writhing as if they were alive. "Daniel." Emma's voice came from behind him, faint but desperate. He glanced over his shoulder. Emma was standing at the top of the stairs, watching him with wide, frightened eyes. Sophie was sobbing quietly in her arms, and Noah stood silently beside them, his expression vacant. Daniel felt a pang of guilt. He didn't want to leave them, not in a place like this, not when he didn't know what he was walking into. But at the same time, he knew they couldn't stay here. They needed answers, and this room, this door, seemed to be the key. With a final, reluctant glance at his family, Daniel turned back to the door. He grasped the handle and twisted it. The door creaked open. Beyond the threshold was a room that seemed to belong to a different time. The air inside was thick with dust, and the walls were lined with faded, peeling wallpaper. A single, dim light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering erratically, casting long shadows across the room. Daniel stepped inside, his heart racing in his chest. The room felt cold, unnaturally so, and there was a smell, an old, musty odor that reminded him of something long forgotten, something buried in the past. As he moved deeper into the room, his foot brushed something hard on the floor. He looked down and saw a small, ornate chest, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. The chest was old, its wood worn with age, but there was something about it that drew him in, something that made his pulse quicken. Without thinking, Daniel crouched down and opened the chest. Inside was a collection of items, old letters, photographs, and a small leather-bound book. The letters were yellowed with age, the ink smudged and faded, but the photographs were more disturbing. They depicted people he didn't recognize, strange, unsettling faces, some of them smiling, others twisted in expressions of fear. But it was the book that caught his attention. It was small, no bigger than the palm of his hand, and it seemed almost too new. The edges of the pages were crisp, as if it had been written recently. Daniel picked it up, his hands trembling as he flipped it open. The first page was blank, but as he turned the pages, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Each page was filled with writing, the ink fresh and vivid against the yellowing paper. The words seemed to blur and shift before his eyes, as if they were written by someone who had been here long before him. And then he saw it. His name, Daniel Harper. His breath caught in his throat. The page was filled with details, things only he could know. His childhood, his career, his struggles, his darkest secrets. Suddenly, the room grew colder, the shadows in the corners deepening. A low whisper filled the air, faint at first, but growing louder. Daniel, the voice was soft, but unmistakable. It was coming from behind him. He whipped around, his heart pounding in his chest, but the room was empty. Then, a figure appeared in the doorway, a shadow, a form that seemed to melt in and out of the darkness. Daniel's breath hitched in his throat. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. The figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, until it was standing just inches away from him. It was a woman. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow, and her mouth stretched into a thin, cruel smile. "You shouldn't have come," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. "Now you'll never leave." The woman in the doorway stood motionless, her eyes locked onto Daniel's with a piercing intensity that sent chills racing down his spine. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs felt like they were made of stone, frozen in place by an unseen force. She stepped closer, the faint, cold air surrounding her chilling him to the bone. The darkness of the room seemed to cling to her, the shadows twisting around her form as if she were part of the very essence of the house itself. Daniel could barely breathe, his pulse hammering in his ears. The voice, soft and ethereal, echoed once again, but this time, it was clearer, louder. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her lips curling into a malicious grin. "Now you will pay for the sins of the past." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. The words sent a shock through him, the weight of their meaning sinking in like a stone in his gut. There was something about this woman, something ancient, something filled with sorrow and rage. He didn't understand why she was here or what she wanted, but the sense of danger was undeniable. He took a shaky step back, his eyes never leaving her. "Who are you?" he stammered. His voice sounded foreign to his own ears, trembling with fear. The woman's smile twisted into something darker. "I am a spirit of vengeance, the past come to claim what is owed," she said. "You have awoken me, Daniel Harper, and now you will suffer for the wrongs that were done here." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as his mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. He had come to this house seeking answers, but what he had found was something far more terrifying. The history of this place, the people who had lived here before, what had they done to summon this vengeful spirit? And why was it targeting him and his family? "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know what you want from me." Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, her lips curling into a smile that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. "You don't need to know, Daniel. All you need to understand is that you are now part of this story, and there is no turning back." A sudden gust of wind swept through the room, causing the lights to flicker and the shadows to dance in the corners. The air grew colder still, and Daniel felt a wave of nausea wash over him as if the very atmosphere was choking him. The woman's form flickered, shifting in and out of focus, and for a moment, Daniel could see another figure behind her. A man, his face contorted in agony, his body skeletal and decayed. He reached out toward Daniel, his hands stretching, grasping for something. "Someone, help us." The man's voice was a rasp, barely a whisper, but it felt like a scream inside Daniel's mind. "You must help us, before it's too late." Before Daniel could react, the woman stepped forward, her hand extending toward him. The chill that radiated from her was unbearable, like the touch of death itself. His breath caught in his throat as she came closer, and without thinking, he reached for the nearest object, a dusty old chair, grabbing it and lifting it as a makeshift weapon. "Stay back," Daniel shouted, his voice hoarse with panic. But the woman didn't flinch. Instead, she simply laughed, a sound that made Daniel's skin crawl. "Do you really think you can stop me with that?" she asked, her voice dripping with contempt. Before he could react, she was upon him, her cold fingers wrapping around his wrist. The air seemed to pulse with energy, as if the very walls of the house were alive, closing in on him. "Your family will suffer for what's been done here," the woman hissed, her breath freezing on his skin. "They will all pay just like you will." Daniel's mind raced, the panic threatening to overwhelm him. He couldn't let her get to his family, not after everything they had been through. He had to protect them. With every ounce of strength he had left, Daniel pulled himself away from her grip, breaking free from her hold. He staggered back, his chest heaving as he fought for control. The woman's laughter echoed in the room, growing louder, more distorted. She reached out, her fingers curling as if she were about to strike, but just as quickly, she stopped. The room fell silent, the oppressive air lifting for a brief moment. Daniel didn't dare to breathe. Then, in an instant, she was gone, vanishing into the darkness as though she had never been there at all. Daniel stood motionless, the chair still clutched in his trembling hands. His heart was racing, the blood pounding in his ears. His entire body shook with fear and disbelief. What had just happened? Had it been real, or was he losing his mind? The room was still cold, the shadows just as thick as before, but there was no sign of the woman, no trace of the horror that had just unfolded. Daniel's eyes flicked to the chest in the corner of the room, the book still lying open in his hands. His name, his darkest secrets, everything was written there. But now there was something else. The words on the page had changed. They were no longer just about his past. They were about his future. The page now read, "The curse is not just upon you, Daniel Harper. It is upon all who enter this house, and it will be your blood that pays the price." A sudden, sharp noise cut through the silence. A scream. Daniel spun around, his heart skipping a beat. The scream was coming from downstairs. It was Emma. Without thinking, he dropped the book and sprinted toward the door, his feet pounding against the floor as he raced down the hallway. The scream came again, louder this time, filled with terror. It was Emma. "Emma!" Daniel shouted as he reached the staircase. He descended quickly, his mind racing with fear. As he reached the bottom, he saw her. She was standing at the foot of the stairs, staring blankly at the doorway to the living room, her face pale with horror. "Emma!" Daniel called again, his voice frantic. "What's wrong? What happened?" Emma's eyes were wide, her lips trembling, but she didn't respond. She didn't move. She was frozen in place, as if paralyzed by fear. And then Daniel saw it. The door to the living room was wide open. Through the doorway, he could see something in the shadows, movement. Something was there. Something, or someone, was waiting for him. Daniel's heart raced as he stood at the foot of the stairs, his eyes locked on the dark doorway to the living room. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, and his breath felt shallow, almost suffocating. Emma stood motionless next to him, her wide, terrified eyes fixed on the door, but she couldn't speak. She was too frozen by fear, as if she had seen something far beyond her understanding. "Emma," Daniel said, his voice barely a whisper, "what happened? What did you see?" She turned to him slowly, her lips trembling, but no words came out. Her gaze flickered to the living room door, and for a brief moment, Daniel thought he saw something in her eyes. Something dark, something that spoke of terror far greater than anything he could have imagined. The stillness was broken by a faint sound coming from the living room. It was a low, drawn-out moan, followed by the creak of old wood, as if someone or something was shifting within the darkness. Daniel's pulse quickened, and he took a hesitant step forward. "Emma," he said again, this time more urgently, "we need to go. Now." But Emma didn't move. She was staring into the room, her face pale as a ghost. Her eyes seemed empty, lost in a place he couldn't reach. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping by the second. It wasn't just a chill. It was a bone-deep cold, the kind that gnawed at you, that made every movement feel labored. Daniel's breath came out in clouds, his skin prickling with a sudden, sharp sense of dread. The moan grew louder, and this time, Daniel heard a low whisper, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a voice he had heard before, faintly, like a distant memory. "Come closer, Daniel. Come see what is waiting for you." His stomach lurched, and his instincts screamed at him to run, to leave this place before whatever haunted it consumed them all. But he couldn't. His feet were rooted to the ground, his body unwilling to move. He had to understand. He had to know what had happened to his family, to this house, to him. The shadows in the living room seemed to shift, growing longer and darker as the voice echoed again, growing more insistent. "Come closer." The whisper was a command now, not a plea, and Daniel could feel it tugging at him, pulling him toward the door. He reached out instinctively to Emma, but she still didn't move. It was as though she was no longer even there, her body present but her mind elsewhere. With a deep breath, Daniel made his decision. He had to face whatever was in there. He had to end this or it would destroy them. Stepping forward, he walked toward the door, each step heavier than the last, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him like a physical force. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the darkness beyond swallowing him whole. Inside, the room was bathed in a sickly, flickering light, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to slither along the walls. The furniture was old, covered in dust, but there was something else in the room now, a presence. It was suffocating, oppressive, like an invisible weight hanging in the air. And then he saw it. At the far corner of the room, the shape of a figure stood, its form barely visible in the dark. Its outline was distorted, flickering in and out of focus like a mirage. At first, Daniel thought it was just his eyes playing tricks on him, but as he stepped further into the room, the figure solidified. A man dressed in tattered clothes, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were hollow, sunken deep into his skull, and his mouth hung open in an eternal scream, though no sound escaped. His hands were outstretched, as if begging for something, or perhaps demanding something. Daniel's blood ran cold. "What do you want?" Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his own heart. "Who are you?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a slow, deliberate step forward, its movement jerky and unnatural. It wasn't walking. It was dragging itself, like something that had been trapped between life and death for too long. The room seemed to shrink around him, the shadows pressing in on all sides. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the air itself were alive with the voices of the past, voices long silenced, now desperate to be heard. "Help us," the figure rasped, its voice a croaking whisper that seemed to come from deep within the earth. "You must help us before it's too late." Daniel's chest tightened. He wanted to turn and run, but his feet wouldn't move. The presence in the room held him captive, as if the very walls were closing in around him. And then, the figure spoke again, this time louder, more forceful, its voice filled with anguish and rage. "Your family must pay for the sins of the past." Daniel's eyes widened in realization. The figure wasn't just some random spirit, it was tied to the house, to the history of this place. It was part of the curse that had been passed down through generations, and now it was demanding something from him. But what? The man stepped closer, his eyes locking onto Daniel's. And for a moment, Daniel felt something deep and primal, inside him stir. It was as if the figure was calling to him, urging him to understand something, to unlock a secret that had been hidden for years. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had to get Emma, he had to protect his family. But the figure was blocking the doorway, preventing him from leaving. "You must stop the cycle," the figure rasped, its voice barely audible. "Only then will it end." But Daniel couldn't understand. What cycle? What did he have to do to stop this? The man in the corner let out a final, anguished scream. And then, as if something had shifted, the figure seemed to disintegrate, fading into nothingness. The room fell silent once more. Daniel stood frozen in place, the air thick with tension, his mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. What had the figure meant? What cycle needed to be stopped? Suddenly, Emma's voice broke through the silence. It was faint, trembling with fear. "Daniel, look." He turned to her, his heart skipping a beat. Emma was standing in the doorway, staring at something in her hands. She was holding an old, weathered book, its pages yellowed with age. And on the cover, written in faded, blood-red letters, was one word: Harper. The old book trembled in Emma's hands as she flipped through the brittle pages, her eyes scanning the faded writing, searching for something, anything, that could explain the horror they were facing. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he watched her, unable to move. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of the figure he had just encountered, of the chilling words it had spoken. "Your family must pay for the sins of the past." But what sins? What was he supposed to do to stop this madness? Emma's fingers hovered over the pages, her face pale as she came across a passage that seemed to resonate with something deep inside her. She looked up at Daniel, her eyes wide with fear. "Daniel, this book," her voice quivered. "It's the key. It holds the truth." She flipped to a page near the end of the book, and Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The page was covered in strange symbols, symbols that looked like a language he had never seen before. The ink was smeared in places, as though someone had written in a hurry, their hand shaking as they wrote down a desperate plea. The symbols seemed to dance on the page, shifting when he wasn't looking directly at them. This is it, isn't it?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is what's been haunting us." Daniel leaned in, his eyes fixed on the symbols. As he stared at them, a cold chill crept over him, spreading from the tips of his fingers to the rest of his body. He could almost hear a faint whisper, like the rustling of pages in a forgotten library, beckoning him to understand. "What does it say?" Daniel asked, his voice tight with fear. Emma's lips parted as she read aloud the words that were written beneath the symbols. The sins of the past are never forgotten. The blood spilled in vengeance will haunt the living until justice is served. The cycle shall continue until the debt is paid. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, each one settling deep into Daniel's chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. His heart raced as the truth slowly started to piece itself together. The sins of the past, the family's dark history. Could this book hold the answers? Vengeance, Daniel murmured. What happened here, Emma? What did we do? Emma's eyes flickered to the next page, where there was another passage. This one was written in a language Daniel could not understand, but there was a sense of recognition deep in his bones, a feeling that this was important, vital to unraveling the curse. She pointed to the passage. I can't read this, but it's clear it's tied to our family, Emma said, her voice trembling. Look at the name at the bottom of the page. Daniel squinted at the name that was written in the same faded red ink. His own name. His stomach twisted as he realized that what Emma had just said was true. This wasn't just a random curse. It was something tied to his bloodline, to his very existence. They had been marked, chosen, or cursed by whatever had been done in the past. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house. It was so deafening that it rattled the windows, shaking the very walls of the room. Emma gasped and dropped the book, her hands trembling as she backed away. What was that? She asked, her voice panicked. Daniel's instincts kicked in, and he turned toward the source of the sound, toward the basement door. The house felt alive with a creeping sense of dread, as though something in the dark depths of the house had just awoken. Something ancient, something angry. I don't know, Daniel said, his voice tight, but we need to check it out. He grabbed the flashlight from the table and led the way toward the basement, his every step weighed down by the terrifying unknown. Emma followed closely behind, her footsteps hesitant, almost as if she could feel the same pressure building in the air that Daniel felt. They reached the door, and Daniel hesitated before grabbing the cold, rusty handle. The door creaked as he slowly turned it, the sound slicing through the silence of the house. The basement was dark, the shadows too thick to see anything clearly. The air smelled musty, heavy with the scent of damp earth and forgotten memories. With a deep breath, Daniel stepped into the darkness, the flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The basement was as he remembered, old furniture covered in sheets, boxes stacked high, and the unmistakable presence of time's slow passage. But something was different. There was a feeling in the air, a pulse that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. It was as though the house itself was alive, waiting, watching. And then he saw it. In the far corner of the basement, a figure stood, cloaked in shadows. At first, Daniel thought it was just another trick of the light, but as he stepped closer, he realized it was something much worse. It was the same figure from the living room, the man in tattered clothes, his eyes hollow and sunken, his mouth hanging open in that eternal scream. His form flickered in and out of focus, like a reflection in a broken mirror. His outstretched hands reached toward Daniel, and with each step, they grew closer. No, Daniel breathed, shaking his head. This can't be happening. Emma grabbed his arm, her grip tight and desperate. Daniel, we need to leave. This is not just a ghost. The figure spoke then, its voice a deep, guttural rasp. The cycle will not end until the sins of your ancestors are paid. Only then will you be free. Daniel's mind raced. He had to do something. He had to stop this before it consumed them all. Who are you? Daniel shouted, his voice trembling but filled with determination. What do you want from us? The figure's eyes locked onto his, its gaze piercing, almost like it was reaching deep into Daniel's soul. And then it spoke, each word filled with ancient sorrow. "We are the ones who were wronged. We were murdered in cold blood, our lives stolen for greed and power. Now we seek justice. We seek vengeance." The words struck Daniel like a blow, and a chill ran through him as the realization hit him like a wave. The sins of the past, the wrongs done to the spirits trapped in this house, were tied to his family. His ancestors had committed atrocities, and now the spirits were coming for him, for his family, demanding retribution. Emma gasped as the figure moved closer, its shadowy form stretching toward them. "Daniel, we have to stop it. We have to break the curse." But Daniel knew, deep down, that breaking the curse wouldn't be so easy. The spirits of the past wouldn't rest until they had what they were owed. The room seemed to spin as the figure raised its arms, and suddenly, the lights in the basement flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. And then, with a bone-chilling scream, the figure lunged toward them. The air in the basement was thick, suffocating, as though it were trying to crush them both. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, the fear in his veins mixing with an undeniable sense of urgency. They had no time to waste. The figure, a specter of death, vengeance, and rage, was closing in, its hollow eyes gleaming with ancient malice. Emma's breath hitched as she grabbed his arm, her fingers cold and trembling. "What are we going to do?" she whispered, barely able to keep her voice steady. "We can't stay here. We can't fight it. What is it? Who are they?" Daniel swallowed hard. His thoughts were scattered, his mind overwhelmed by the horrors that had unfolded over the past few days. But one thing was clear. The spirits weren't going to stop until their thirst for revenge was quenched. They had no intention of letting Daniel or Emma or anyone from their bloodline go free. He looked around, desperately searching for anything, any clue that might help them. The basement was dark, with shadows clinging to the corners like ghostly fingers. The cluttered furniture and old boxes seemed to shift before his eyes, as if they, too, were alive, watching, waiting. "Emma, we need to find a way out," Daniel said, his voice tight. "We have to stop it before they destroy us." But Emma shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. "There is no way out. The house is alive. They know everything about us. They won't let us go." Her words hit Daniel like a slap, and for a moment, the hopelessness of the situation seemed to settle over him. He could hear the slow, rasping breaths of the figure behind them, and he could feel the weight of the spirit's anger pressing down on him. They were trapped, and there was nowhere to run. But then something shifted in Daniel's mind. The book, the strange symbols, the words. There had to be a way to break the curse, a way to free themselves from the grip of the past. He remembered what Emma had read from the book earlier, the passage about the cycle, the vengeance, and the blood that must be paid. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to stop it, to appease the spirits and end the curse once and for all. "Wait," Daniel said, his voice coming out stronger this time. "Emma, the book, we didn't read all of it. There has to be more. There must be something in there that tells us how to end this." Emma's eyes flickered to the basement stairs, the dark silhouette of the figure closing in on them. "I don't know if we have time," she said, her voice filled with desperation. "They're getting closer. We need to leave now." "No," Daniel said, shaking his head. "We can't leave until we understand what we're up against. We need the truth." He pulled away from Emma and turned to the stairs, quickly moving back toward the room upstairs where the book still lay. His mind was spinning, but he focused all of his energy on finding the answers, on unraveling the mystery that had haunted them since they first stepped into this cursed house. Emma followed reluctantly, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds, her fear palpable. But Daniel pressed on, feeling a strange sense of resolve building inside him. The past, the spirits, the cycle, they all had a purpose, and he had to figure it out. For their sake, for their survival. They reached the living room, and Daniel hurried to the table where the book had been left. Its pages still open to the passage about the vengeance and the sins of the past. He skimmed through the pages, his eyes scanning for something, anything, that could give him the solution. And then he found it. Near the back of the book, the last few pages were filled with a detailed account of an ancient ritual. The words were faint, barely legible, but they were unmistakable. This was the answer. This was how they could break the curse. "Emma, listen to this," Daniel said, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and excitement. "This ritual, it's the only way. It says here that the only way to end the vengeance is to offer the spirits what they want. To give them justice for the blood that was spilled." Emma peered over his shoulder, her breath catching in her throat as she read the passage. "But what does that mean? What do we have to do?" Daniel ran his fingers over the words, his mind racing. "It says here that we need to make a sacrifice. Not blood, but something more. Promise. A vow to end the cycle, to free the souls trapped in this house. Only then will they release us." Emma's eyes widened. "A vow? But what vow? What do they want?" Daniel's gaze drifted to the door, and for the first time, he felt a deep sense of dread fill his chest. He could feel the spirits drawing closer, their anger rising like a storm. "It says, we have to promise to right the wrongs of the past, to make things right for the people they were once tied to bring justice to the lives that were destroyed." "But how?" Emma asked. "How can we do that? What wrongs?" Daniel's thoughts raced, his mind flickering between the words of the ritual and the tragic history of his family. His ancestors, they had committed unspeakable acts, wronged people, and taken lives for power and gain. He had no idea how to fix it, how to undo the sins of the past. But he knew one thing for sure: they couldn't outrun it. They couldn't hide. The door slammed open behind them with a deafening crash, and the figure from the basement stepped into the room. Its hollow eyes were locked onto them, filled with an unholy fury. It raised its hand, and Daniel could feel the temperature in the room plummet. The spirits were here. They had come for their vengeance. Daniel turned to Emma, his eyes filled with desperation. "We have to do this. We have to make the vow. It's our only chance." Emma nodded, her face pale and terrified. Together, they stepped forward, and Daniel spoke the words of the ritual aloud, his voice trembling but firm. "I vow to right the wrongs of the past, to bring justice to those who were wronged. I vow to free the souls trapped in this house, to end the cycle of vengeance." As the words left his mouth, a deafening silence filled the room. The figure took a step closer, its form flickering with darkness, but something shifted in the air. The temperature rose slightly, and the pressure in the room seemed to lessen. "Do you promise?" the figure rasped, its voice like the wind howling through a broken window. "I promise," Daniel said, his voice steady now, as though the vow itself had given him strength. The figure's hollow eyes narrowed, and then, with a final scream that seemed to tear through the very fabric of reality, it vanished. For a moment, everything was still. The air was thick with the weight of what had just happened. Emma looked at Daniel, her eyes wide with disbelief. Did we do it? Is it over?" Daniel wasn't sure, but he knew they had taken the first step toward breaking the curse. Whatever lay ahead, they had made their choice, and now they could only hope that it was enough. The room was deathly silent. Daniel and Emma stood still, their breaths shallow, hearts pounding as they waited for any sign that the spirits had been appeased. The figure, the embodiment of their family's past sins, was gone. But there was still a strange chill in the air, a lingering presence that refused to leave. Daniel clenched his fists. They had made their vow, but the question hung heavy in the air. Had they done enough? Emma stepped forward cautiously, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think it worked?" she asked, her eyes scanning the room, looking for any sign of the spectral forces that had plagued them. "I don't know," Daniel replied, his tone heavy with uncertainty. "But we have to believe it did." They moved through the house, slowly and cautiously, as though they were afraid to disturb the fragile peace that had settled over them. The oppressive feeling from before had lifted, but the darkness seemed to hang in the corners, refusing to vanish completely. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind through the cracks in the walls, seemed to echo with the spirit's rage. It felt like an eternity had passed since they first arrived in this cursed house, and yet, it felt as though the battle was far from over. Suddenly, the air grew thick again, the temperature plummeting, and the shadows seemed to twist and writhe as though alive. Emma gasped, her body freezing in place. "Daniel, look!" From the corner of the room, a figure materialized, a translucent shape, flickering like a dying candle. The ghostly figure was barely recognizable, its features twisted and contorted in a grotesque mask of agony and anger. "Do you think you can escape us?" The voice rasped, echoing with the anger of centuries. It was not the figure from the basement. This one was different, more ancient, more powerful. Emma stepped back, her eyes wide with terror. "No, we did everything right. We promised. The figure took a step forward, its form becoming clearer, solidifying before their eyes. The room grew colder, and Daniel could feel the weight of the specter's malevolent gaze pressing down on him. This wasn't the end. "You can never undo the wrongs of your ancestors," the figure hissed, its voice filled with a venomous hatred. "You cannot erase the blood spilled, the lives taken in the name of greed and power. The price must be paid." Daniel's heart sank as the truth hit him like a tidal wave. The curse hadn't just been placed upon him. It was woven into the very fabric of his family's history. The spirits had been wronged, yes, but they were bound by something far darker than just anger. They were bound by a thirst for justice that would never be quenched. Not by a promise, not by words, but Daniel started, his voice trembling with desperation. "We made the vow. We tried to fix it. The figure raised its hand, a cold, ethereal finger pointing directly at him. "You cannot change fate. The price is always the same. Blood for blood." With a horrifying screech, the figure lunged at Daniel, its form collapsing into darkness. For a moment, everything seemed to vanish, and then the world exploded into chaos. Daniel felt an icy hand grip his throat, squeezing, suffocating him. He tried to scream, but the air had been stolen from his lungs. His vision blurred as the shadows closed in, swallowing him whole. Emma reached for him, her voice screaming his name, but it was all drowned out by the deafening silence that had descended over everything. The last thing Daniel saw before everything went black was the fleeting image of the figure. A skeletal shape, standing in the doorway, its hollow eyes locked on him with an almost pitying gaze. When Daniel opened his eyes, the world was different. The house was silent, the oppressive presence gone. Emma was beside him, her hand on his chest, shaking him gently. "Daniel, are you okay?" He blinked, the fog in his mind slowly lifting as he sat up. "What happened?" he rasped. "Where is it? The spirit?" Emma shook her head, her face pale and drawn. I don't know. It was like it never happened. Everything's gone." Quiet, Daniel looked around, his senses still on edge. He could feel it, the weight of something lingering just beyond the edge of perception. It wasn't over. He could feel the blood of the past running through his veins, tying him to something that he could never escape. But there was something else now, something familiar. A voice echoed in his mind. It wasn't the spirit's voice. It was Emma's. "The price is always the same," she had said, her eyes wide with fear. He turned to her, his heart sinking. "Emma, what did you mean by that?" She looked at him, her eyes filled with regret and something darker. Something that hadn't been there before. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought we could escape it. But I knew the truth." Daniel stood, his legs shaky beneath him, his thoughts swirling. The walls of the house seemed to close in around him, tightening like a vice. He had seen something that would haunt him forever. He had felt the weight of the curse, the undeniable truth that they were never truly free. The price had been paid, but not in the way they had expected. And now they would never escape the past.